Welcome to the Old St. Andrews podcast, Making It Real. I'm Tim Squire.
Corey Bowie.
It's indeed a blessing to be with all of you. And today's topic is a hot one. We're going to talk about consumerism in the church. So with that said, I'm going to share with you all a meme that was, well, I guess I shouldn't say was, it is kind of floating around places like Facebook, Instagram, and things like that. So let me bring that up on the screen for us. There it is. Consumerism turned the church into a service provider. I want good preaching. I want amazing worship. I want great kids programs. Would we go to church if it was just a bunch of ragamuffin Jesus followers gathering around a table? And I can't even see the rest of it because of my banner. Let me move that off of there. Would we go to church if it was just a bunch of ragamuffin Jesus followers gathering around the table trying to love God and love neighbors? So that's our conversation this morning. So Corey, I shared that with you yesterday. Any thoughts on this meme?
When you brought up the church and consumerism, I said, what? And then you showed me the meme and it started sinking in. And then I started reading more of these articles, and I didn't before that see the connection between how we consume and how we view church and our gathering and what we get out of church. So interesting connection. Looking forward to exploring it more.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I did for this conversation is I went ahead and sent a couple articles to Corey to read in light of our conversation today. And I just have to say, and Corey, I think you can second this, is if you Google consumerism in the church, you will find hundreds, if not thousands, of articles on it. Would you agree, Corey?
Many. I scrolled through several pages myself.
Yeah. And so I just sent her basically two articles to read. And so we're going to draw attention to some of the themes that came out of there. I do want to say that if you're following the podcast live, you can respond in the comment box. And if you have something that you want to say or respond to in light of what you see on the screen or what you hear us talk about, please do it. And we will share that online and let people know that what you're thinking. So with that said, I'm going to turn to some notes that I took. First of all, I want to draw attention to the actual articles that I sent to Corey. One was called Church Shopping and Consumerism, and that is found on a website called ChristianMinimalism.com. There's an interesting title, an interesting website. And then there's another one that you'll find in the website called medium.com. I love medium.com. I go there a lot to actually review and see different kinds of articles from all kinds of topics. And this article was called The High Cost of Consumer Christianity. With that, let's start by defining, and Corey, if you have that article in front of you,
I do.
If you would share with us what we mean by consumerism, I think that would help us get started.
Right. So I think the general consensus is consumerism is a cultural ethic born out of the advent of mass production and further cemented by the advertising boom. They related to the 50s and 60s, but consumerism hinges on the fact that if we only bought what we needed, our economy would collapse. Therefore, consumerism is to create artificial demand for goods and services you don't really need and probably didn't even know existed. The author of this article further goes on to say that consumerism is so much more than an advertising strategy. It's a worldview that fundamentally alters the way we approach our bodies, our relationships, our mental health, and our religion.
Okay. Any personal thoughts on that when you read that?
Well, I think it kind of hits home. I was recently car shopping, and I shared that with Tim, that wants versus needs, and do I really need this? I don't. And that consumerism, it's there. And um, I didn't just realize how far it went, with your mental health and other aspects in your relationships. And the bigger is better. And you know uh, all these things that are just built into our culture, that seep into our real lives.
Yeah, I think that there's no doubt that uh, consumerism has so invaded who we are as human beings, especially in the United States.
Yes.
I don't have the statistics in front of me, but we are one of the countries that does some of the most consuming. And just read again recently that we're also, I think, second to China in the polluting that we do. And we should have a podcast on global warming and all of that kind of stuff too, just to talk about that in light of this consumerism thing. So I want to draw attention in the other article. You just read to us a very brief definition of consumerism. And by the way, folks, we have 30 to 40 minutes to cover a topic that could take a semester. You could take a semester class on in a college or a high school. So just know that there's a lot of information out there, and we're just going to try to highlight some of the things. In the other article that we shared together and read, um, the author defines one of the key premises of consumerism in the church under the notion of church shopping. And I'm going to guess that a lot of us have actually heard that phrase. Maybe some of us or a lot of us have actually used the phrase to say, oh, I'm going to shop for another church because I don't like the preacher's sermons. I mean, that, trust me, I've heard that. So this author says that the practice of church shopping has slowly made its way into our experience as Christians, spurred on by Western consumer culture. It perpetuates a cycle of constantly rotating churches based on preferences and personal needs, rather than settling into a congregation for the long haul, getting involved and building relationships. Now, Corey, I don't know about you, but what I hear there is this dichotomy, I guess, getting set up between one's personal needs. I want this from my church versus the idea of gathering in a church community based on the relationships.
Right. And I think that's where maybe a lot of us don't realize that when we're making decisions like that, we're actually putting ourselves first.
Yeah. And the question I've always had as a clergy person is, what kind of negative effect does the me first have on the relationships that people have with one another in a church?
Hmm.
You know, if I've been in a church for 3, 4, 5 years and I've developed these relationships, and then one day I come into the congregation or I come in to talk with some of the people that I've built relationships with and say, I'm not coming here anymore. And they're like, well, why? Because I don't like the preaching anymore. You know, we got that new pastor. He doesn't preach like Father Joe used to preach, and I don't like it anymore. Well, what about the relationships?
Right. It does take away that impact of what's important. And I guess it's moving the importance to how they feel versus how everyone feels.
And what's interesting is in one of the articles, they talk about the notion that consumerism tends to fly in the face of what Jesus preached.
True.
Jesus preached this notion of caring about the other and putting the other first. And so the me first mentality is actually what Jesus was preaching
Yeah,
against in his own culture.
I see that.
And so in the article, the first article we read, as you can see on the banner that I just put up, there were three major points to a consumerist culture in church that were argued by this author. And the first one I want to draw attention to is called Focus on Me. So the first point is this idea of focus on me. And let me just share a little phrase from that. We have internalized consumerism's focus on self so much that we now do it when we look for a church home. Sermon not to our liking? Didn't sing your favorite song? Pastor, worship leader, congregants not wearing skinny jeans and plaid shirts? If the worship service isn't 100% what we want, we move on, or we complain tirelessly to leaders to make it what we want. And when that doesn't happen, we move on. I don't know, Corey, have you actually experienced that in your life?
Uh, I have to be honest. um, sure. You know, there's been points where I thought, oh, well, I don't understand why we're talking about this, or I didn't like that. Certainly, it's come up.
Okay.
Um, Not enough to leave a place, but enough to complain about it.
Gotcha. Have you, and since we're being honest and we're making it real, have you ever experienced yourself or others at Old St. Andrews behaving in a me first way?
Unfortunately, yes. I think again, I said, I'm guilty myself. So I think we all have to consider this in our own light and how we approach things. But it really is not just about us. We're a community, and it's about everyone. And just because myself, don't like one aspect or something, doesn't mean someone else might not. And I think we're trying to reach a group of people, and you can't always make, I guess, everyone feel perfect and happy all the time. But is that the expectation?
Yeah. And I think you bring up a good point there. Lots of people will say in a church, let's say a rector is having a frustrating month or a week, or, the vestry had somebody complaining they don't like this or like that. And you'll hear it all the time. Leaders will tell leaders, well, you can't please everybody all the time. Yet what seems to be the reality is, but everybody wants to be pleased all the time.
Right. And maybe we don't always realize that is going on. Um, so I think bringing these things up and challenging yourself and thinking about that in your own world, you might think about it in a different way.
Yeah, it definitely gives me pause when I think about the things in my life that I'm very demanding about, that I want to be served first before I recognize that maybe somebody else should be served first. I mean, lots of things,
Mm.
everyday things, standing in line at the convenience store trying to get a cup of coffee and rolling my eyes that there's a long line because there's only two cashiers instead of, I mean, there's only one cashier instead of two. And I'm frustrated because I'm like, I got to go. I got things to do. And very self-serving,
Very.
and so it's even in the small things. The second point that gets made here, let me switch my little banner here, is called losing interest. And here's a quote from that section of the article. We have begun looking at churches the same way we look at our stuff: expendable, discardable. The minute something is not to our liking, or we just simply lose interest, we pull our tithes and offerings and or leave. Congregations which should be mission stations devoted to loving and serving God and others have become consumable products that we can chuck whenever we want. It's a faith community built upon the foundation of Jesus Christ. Thoughts on that one? That I have literally experienced that as a rector. I have had people come to me and say, I don't like this. Goodbye.
What makes me upset by that is that we're all part of change. And if you don't like something, it doesn't mean that you should just leave and find the other perfect place. I don't think there's ever going to be a perfect place if you don't put the effort in yourself. Um, so that challenge, always constantly looking for something that works for you. It totally relates to our culture for sure. These jeans are out of style. I'm going to go get a new pair. Or so, if this situation isn't working for me, I'm just going to go find something new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this idea of perfection
Right.
is something we'll tell people. Human beings will tell each other all the time, you can't be perfect, and yet we keep striving for perfection. I always tell my kids when they're doing their sports activities, I'm like, nobody is expecting you to be perfect, and if they are, you shouldn't listen to them, because there's no such thing as achieving perfection. Striving for excellence, now I think that's another thing. And I think striving to do your best and give your all, that's one thing. My kids, especially my daughter, on occasion will text Chris and me and say, I didn't really do well on that test. And first of all, I'll remind her it was one exam. So you got to remember that. Secondly, I'll ask her, did you do your best? Did you put the knowledge that you had, did you put it on the piece of paper to the best of your ability? If you did that, then that's all anybody can ask. But we have this, I think, just unreasonable notion that we should have the perfect whatever.
Right.
So,
The pressure's out there, especially with social media
mhm,
and this feeling of, competing with your posts and your likes and these perfect pictures of, what life is supposed to be. It relates to our religious community. And
exactly.
it isn't perfect, but by working all together, I think you can go in the right direction rather than zigzagging your way through trying to find that perfect place.
And that's just it.
That's
There is not a perfect place. And if for those of us who have, I think, committed the difficult or painful reality of being consumers in church, who think we're going to go somewhere else and find the perfect place, it's not there. It's just not there. And so striving for this idea of perfection, it's funny, Corey, you brought up the idea of social media. I lately, for those of you who don't realize it, podcasts like what we're doing have become the rage lately. Talk about consumerism. The podcast has become the thing. There are thousands of podcasts out there. You can go to Apple Podcasts. It's an app on your phone. I'm highly confident that Android phones have one too. I don't know what it's called. And there are podcasts on everything. Well, my son Aiden and I, when I drive him to wrestling, we listen to Crime Junkies. It's a podcast that's become famous, and it's about people who are missing, who get murdered, infamous serial killers, all this kind of stuff. And one of the things that is an overriding theme in that, when there is some sort of murder or a kidnapping or something, is when they start asking witnesses or neighbors, tell us about that family. Tell us about that individual. They were the perfect family. It looked like nothing was wrong. When you go to their social media account, all the pictures show, mom, dad, 2.5 kids, the dog laying in the front of the picture. And we keep trying to create this imagery as human beings of perfection, and it's not real.
Yeah. And it's out there, and you're actually, by the likes and all those things, you're encouraged to just do it more and more. um yeah, it's a tough thing to try and live with, especially young people. And yeah.
Yeah. And we keep striving for something that's not there,
Right.
and keep banging our head against the wall, wondering why it's not there. And that is 100% applicable to the idea of church. And I think this notion of church shopping, give me what I want or tell me where the door is futile. The third major point that is brought up in this article is the idea of confusing wants with needs. Now, Corey, I don't know about you, but this became kind of the highlight for me of the article. Let me just share a quick quote from the article. When we church shop, we typically confuse needs with wants, and we look for a church that meets our needs. This is basic church consumption. We shop for a church the way we shop for anything else. But what really is happening when we look for a church that meets our needs is that we are confusing needs and wants. What we think we need in a congregation is almost always a want. Now, I want all the listeners to really hear that. What we think we need in a congregation is almost always a want. Do we really need the pastor to look the way we personally think a pastor should look? Do we need the worship music to 100% reflect exactly how we think the music should be? No, of course not. Our actual spiritual needs are that the church is Jesus's beacon of light and hope, that the good news is proclaimed and people gather together to read the Bible, pray, and worship together, and that they are sent out to share the good news with others. Almost everything else is a want. Corey, thoughts on that?
Well, I think we've all been in a position to find a new church home at some point. We've
Yep.
moved, we've whatever the situation is, and I recall the first day I walked into Old St. Andrews, and the intention was to church shop. We had recently moved to the area, so it wasn't that we were leaving another church community. But my family was not sure exactly what church we were going to end up in. Um, we live very close, so Old St. Andrews was the first on our list based on distance to our home,
Mm-hmm.
and primarily that was the reason. But I have to say, when we did show up for the first time, our kids were very young, and we were immediately accepted into the community, um, in a way that we didn't even consider looking anywhere else. But I understand. I think we went into that with a checklist, and what we realized was the checklist didn't matter, because we just felt the community and the love in this building. And so, I can see where there are, you have a family, you want kid oriented and youth programs, and you want music, or everyone wants different things. So I understand the checklist and that idea of it. But when it comes down to it, it really, like you said, it doesn't matter. There's only, if we're praying and we're reading the Bible and scripture, and what else really is church supposed to be?
So, can you remember specifically any one or few items that was on your checklist
Well,
aside from distance?
distance was number one.
Distance was number one.
So it very, very funny that the our previous church had um a male priest. So for some reason I expected just a male, a male person, being the up in front. So that was one of the expectations, I guess, in the back of my mind. But also, I wanted youth programs. I wanted something for our kids. That was the one of the big reasons that we wanted to pursue a church. And there was a small community of children, but not a lot. Not what I originally expected to have, and what we had in our previous church. So that it didn't fill that box, but I could see that we could be involved and that our kids could be happy.
Gotcha. So I'm curious, did any of your checklist items require a church to be open and affirming to the LGBTQ community?
It wasn't on my mind.
Okay. What about a church that was seeking to deal with racism in America, racial reconciliation? Was that
Definitely. And one reason we moved to Bloomfield was to be in a diverse community. That was a very conscious decision of ours.
okay? Because the reason I ask that is because my experience when I see people's checklists, or when somebody new shows up and said, "Well, this is what we're looking for in a church," it is rare when the movements that are fighting against injustice, inequality in the world are first on the list.
Mm.
Usually it's like you said, and I'm not pointing a finger at you. This is true of, I'd say, 90 to almost 100% of church shoppers. I want something that's going to provide for my kids. I want some sort of entertainment value for my children that teaches them the Bible.
Mhm.
I want good music. And what people mean by good music can vary person to person. I want this style of worship versus this style. It is rare when the social justice issues of our time are out there that they get brought up as the primary reason.
Right. And I realized that the checklist was pretty much all about me and my family.
So you're willing to admit that it was definitely consumerist driven.
Definitely.
Yeah, I understand that, very clearly. And so, that brings us back to our first question. Let me bring that up on the screen again. Would we go to church if it was just a bunch of ragamuffin Jesus followers gathering around a table trying to love God and love neighbors? That's a pretty heavy duty question. I mean, I know it's really a yes, no question, but I think we have to expand on that. I have to say that I think many people would not go to church if that's what it only was. If it was just a ragamuffin group of people following Jesus that were gathering around a table trying to love God and love neighbor. Now, I'm totally willing to have somebody say, "You're completely wrong on that, Tim." And that would make me happy, actually. My experience has showed me that at the top of this meme, that people first and foremost want a service provided to them. And for those few folks who are listening with us live, you're seeing the question here. If you want to answer it in the comment box, please do, because we're happy to hear you say, do you all think that if it was just a ragamuffin group of Jesus followers gathering around a table to love God and love one another, if that's all that the church was offering, would that be good enough? Or is consumerism so deeply embedded in who we are as the church that we just have to accept that fact? Corey, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, it's a hard question. And you want to hope to think that yes, you would do that. But it's tough. It's a tough question to answer because I think our expectations are so much more than that.
Well, we just got a comment from Shirley Murtha. She says, "My answer to the last question is yes. That's what I go to church for. The rest is not important to me." All right. So there's Shirley giving her thought on it. So,
Well, I know I enjoy at this point we have a choice now. We can go to a spoken liturgy or music with our choir, and I by far enjoy the music with the choir. I think it is an additive to the experience and how my spiritual relates to the service.
Mm-hmm. It's funny you bring that up because, as you know, you're a member of our staff. You know, our big challenge right now as a community is what groups are going to worship when, and I call that a smorgasbord of opportunity. Or imagine a buffet laid out in front of us, and I can choose. You know, I can choose this sort of dish, or I can choose this sort of dish. The church, and I don't just mean OSA, I would say almost every church has had to deal with well, I only like this style of worship. So I want that provided for me. So I want this at 10 o'clock. And then you'll have somebody who'll come and say, yeah, but Sundays are too busy for me because of all the other consumerist things we're doing. So I can't attend on Sunday. So I want Saturday. And then you'll have the flip side. And I get this every single time I make decisions on when worship is going to be offered. And the most recent one came from my wife. Chris, if you're following it all, I'm throwing you under the bus here, but she has not been the only one to say this. She'll say, OSA is not big enough, Tim, to have more than one service if we're going to be there first and foremost for the relationships we're building. And she's really got a point. You know, does it make sense to have 3 services that have 5 to 25 people versus the notion of if all 3 of those services were worshiping together, you'd be more realistically probably pushing 40 to 50 people gathered together. And those 40 to 50 gathered together would intentionally be doing that first and foremost thing is worshiping God, singing and praising God together, hearing from scripture how we should go out and change the world for the better. So listen, I don't have the answer to this. And I'm as guilty as any other rector of saying, oh, 5 people here want this service and 10 want this service and 20 want this service. I'm going to provide it all. And then, you know, the local therapist or the bishop will say, you spreading yourself too thin. But the reality is, and Corey, if you have a challenge to this, I would love to hear it, is do we set ourselves up for failure on building our relationships when we are only providing what the desire is of each individual?
Well, I think it goes to try to feed that notion of that that what everyone wants is more important than what they need, and it takes the focus away.
Yeah. Okay. So if we look at some of these decisions we make as the wants, I want this type of service. I want this type of music. I want food after the 5 o'clock service on a Saturday. I want flowers on the altar, whatever it might be. What is the need? And maybe the larger question is, how do we understand the reality of need in a over-consuming society? I don't think I can tell you what my needs really are anymore, Corey.
Right. We're just so bombarded with what we should have that it's hard to imagine not having all that stuff.
Yeah.
And getting down to the really basics of what the need is.
I mean, I think anybody would say, well, basic needs are food, shelter, clothing, those kind of things. But let's take for clothing, for example. I need to have clothing to either be cool or stay warm. And, you know, society expects us not to run around unclothed. But do I need, as you and I were talking before the podcast, do I need 20 pairs of shoes?
Right. No.
I don't. Do I need a closet full of clothes that if I were to actually go through it, I could probably identify 10 shirts that I wear on a rotational basis consistently, and there's 30 other shirts in there I've worn one time. So when we look at that in light of the church, I think maybe what we can leave ourselves with to ponder is, what do we truly need to be a church community? We're pretty good at identifying the wants.
Right. Definitely.
But what does a church community, a group of people that have pledged their lives to following the way of Jesus, what do we need to be that community? Well, I think we've reached the end of our time. We've kind of wrestled around with this question for a little bit. I want to thank those who have joined us for this conversation on the live stream. I want to remind everybody that this will be a recording that will be available to everyone out in the community to listen at a later date. So the recording will be out there. And so with all of that said, thank you for joining us. Next week's conversation, go to figure on this, we're going to be having Liz Miller join us as our director of music here at OSA. And we are going to talk about some of the music offerings, some of the music challenges, some of the ins and outs of how music happens here at Old St. Andrews. Thank you, everybody. Have a blessed week. God bless. And I want to remind you, please spend the week thinking about, what is it the church needs for us to be the body of Christ?